This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody. This time, we're taking debate into a new realm, for us at least, which is, in a word, fashion. Yes, I mean fashion, as in clothing and clothing design and the business around those things. Our particular focus is a part of the scene that didn't really exist until relatively recently. Fast fashion. Fast fashion. Now, if you recognize retail storefronts and online companies with names like Zara, H&M, Shein, Brandy Melville, then you have seen places that are doing fast fashion. Fast fashion is the practice by some manufacturers of very quickly producing new lines of clothing based on what is just becoming hot and hip and getting those items into stores with amazing speed and offering them all at amazingly low prices, with the result that shoppers, especially younger shoppers, are buying this stuff up and wearing it proudly, but not necessarily wearing it out. Rather, they keep going back for more and more new stuff because it's new, and there's always something new just hitting the stores. So what's the debate? It's about who is really winning and losing in this process. Because on the one hand, fast fashion gives lots of people a chance to be in vogue in a way that they can afford. There's lots of choice and access if you're in a market that delivers fast fashion. But it is also argued that the prices are so low because the workers making the clothing are being exploited, and that the environment is suffering owing to all of these clothes not being worn out, but being thrown out the minute that fashion changes, which is pretty frequently. So with the phenomenon of Black Friday in mind, something to consider is our debate question for this one. Fast fashion, shop or stop? So let's introduce our debaters. Here to argue the answer to that question is stop. I want to welcome Kenneth Pucker. Kenneth is an investor in and board member at Rag & Bone, as well as former COO of Timberland. He teaches sustainability as professor of the practice at Tufts University Fletcher School. Kenneth, welcome to Open to Debate. It's so great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
And here to argue that the answer to that question should be shop, I want to welcome Katherine Mangu-Ward. Katherine is editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine, a returning debater, and someone who thinks and writes a lot about capitalism and culture. Katherine, welcome back to Open to Debate.
Delighted to be here.
So let's get on to our opening statements. We want each of you to take a few minutes to explain your position, why you are shop or why you are stop. Kenneth, you are up first. You are arguing that when it comes to fast fashion, it is time to stop. Please tell us why.
Thanks, John. Fashion is a creative, expressive, and dynamic industry. It's also increasingly fast-moving and destructive. 2 decades ago, the industry produced around 50 billion units of clothing and footwear annually, with most garments made from natural materials. Today, where brands today or then typically produce 2 seasons, spring and fall. This changed with deregulation and the advent of fast fashion. Brands including H&M, Zara, and Uniqlo realized that newness accelerated consumption. Consequently, these brands shifted from 2 deliveries per year to 18 to 20 deliveries per year, while introducing 10 to 20 times the number of styles as compared to their competitors. They also increased their use of synthetics like polyester, which is derived from oil, and cut the average price of a garment in half as compared to comparably positioned brands. Today, H&M and Zara's fast fashion model looks quaint and slow, supplanted by a new model which I call instant fashion. Chinese brand Shein personifies this shift. A decade ago, the brand Shein had revenues of about $500 million. Most Americans had never even heard of the brand. Today, Shein is 80 times bigger, with sales topping $40 billion. How did they achieve this great level of commercial success? Well, it was by relying on fossil fuel-based inputs, putting newness on steroids, and slashing prices. On average, Shein introduces more than 5,000 new styles a day. It introduces as many new styles in 1 week as Zara does in a year, at average prices 60% below Zara, with more than 80% of its products made from oil. The average price of a Shein top is $10. Outerwear and jeans sell for less than $20 per item. How is it possible, you might wonder, for them to achieve these results? Well, a couple things. First, Shein has a prodigious business model based on speed, gamification, and AI. So far, so good. However, much of Shein's success comes on the backs of the workers and the health of the planet. For example, Shein uses air freight to ship about 1 million packages per day to the United States. Air freight releases about 40 times the carbon per package as compared to ocean freight. Shein is not compensating anyone for the carbon emissions associated with its production and shipping. And today, Shein is a top 5 carbon emitter in the world of fashion. The company has been caught using banned cotton from Chinese Uyghurs, slave labor in violation of the U.S. law, though it caps its workers' schedules at 60 hours per week of time in the factories. An investigation by a Swiss NGO revealed that many factory workers are still working over 75 hours per week. More than 100 brands and independent designers, including Adidas, Doc Marten, Ralph Lauren, and Levi Strauss, have sued Shein for stealing their designs and violating their IP. As a result of Shein and their ilk, the fashion industry now produces between 100 and 150 billion units per year, mostly made from oil, 85% of which are landfilled or incinerated. The industry is one of the most pollutive industries in the world, responsible for more than 20% of the world's wastewater, a growing percentage of carbon emissions, and more than 30% of all microfiber production, not to mention chemicals released as effluent into waterways and labor abuses. The fashion industry's success increasingly comes from privatizing profit while socializing damage. It's time we do things differently.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. Katherine, it's your turn now. You are answering that the question should be of stop or shop should be answered with a shop. You have 4 minutes to make your case.
First of all, thank you so much. As a former 90s teenager, being in the presence of someone who worked at Timberland is a joy and a delight. I'm here in my H&M shirt and my Zara boots to defend shop. So listen, clothes are really important to us. They're important to us in the way that food and shelter and clothing are important to us, but they're also important to us in the way that art and love and beauty are important. And so I think it's no surprise that this topic gets everybody feeling very spicy and is so personal to so many people. I'm going to argue that fast fashion is a force for good. And this is not just because I'm an annoying contrarian, but also because I really believe that it's true. So, I wanted to talk about kind of the economic importance of fast fashion as well as the ways that it fuels innovation. And I want to try and respond to some of those criticisms, which are important. So worrying about fast fashion is not new. My predecessor at Reason, Virginia Postrel, has written about in the 15th century, new draperies causing a scandal. A Venetian ambassador in 1546 is saying these fabrics cost little and last less. So this is an old debate, and it's one that we're going to keep coming back to. First, I want to just talk about the economic importance of affordable clothing, which I think can get lost in this conversation. Cheap clothes for people who don't have a lot of resources are a major factor in quality of life. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average American household spent about $1,500 on apparel in 2021, and that goes a lot farther when clothes are cheap. So this not only enables people to save money, it also means that people can move more easily between different socioeconomic classes. I think that can be really underappreciated. Second, worker choice. So I want to set aside the slave labor question. I think that is a huge problem and one that we should be focusing on solving both in China and as customers. But most cheap clothes are made by people who chose those jobs. In Bangladesh, the garment industry employs 4 million people, and they all, as a general matter, get above average wages for their region. They choose these jobs because they are better options. I don't want to be paternalistic and tell people that they should not be allowed to both create and then take jobs that are better for them. Innovation. This is another kind of underappreciated aspect of fast fashion. It's really exciting and fun to have this very rapid turnover of clothes. This is a form of self-expression. It's a form of, not just kind of aesthetic innovation, but also commercial innovation. Those Venetian merchants that I mentioned in the 1550s also drove incredibly important changes in global trade. The same was true of the innovation of the department store. The same is true here. Massive, rapid transit of goods and services across the world is generally a force for good, and something that I think is particular to the fashion industry, in part because intellectual property there does operate differently. Looser intellectual property has meant really robust and exciting creative kind of creation in that space. Finally, of course, environmental regulation. This is something that is not special to the fashion industry. And I think that that's really the kind of framework we need to talk here. Yeah, we should probably do a better job of pricing carbon. Yes, we have a failure of environmental regulation all around the globe. Looking specifically at fashion, I think misses the forest for the trees. In conclusion, fashion is important to us. We say that the clothes make the man, or maybe like we are what we wear. I'm not sure. We are people who want to do economic growth. We are people who want to be beautiful. We are people who want to do exciting things. And we're also people who are not great at managing our environmental resources right now. That matches up. It's nothing special about fashion, and I think we shouldn't forget the upsides.
Thank you very much, Katherine. I just want to note a sign that this issue is in the air these days. Saturday Night Live did a whole skit around this topic just a few months back.
Tank tops, $3.99. New merch daily. Fresh fits. No prisoners. Normal number of working hours each week.
So like 40 or what?
Don't worry about it.
That performance suggests that something sketchy is going on in this field, which is a one-sided argument. But at Open to Debate, we always look at two sides, at least. So that's what we're going to do. And the question we're taking on is fast fashion, shop or stop. I'm here with our debaters, Katherine Mangu-Ward, who is editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine, and Kenneth Pucker, board member at Rag & Bone. We're going to have some discussion now around your opening arguments, and I just want to tell you what I heard in your opening arguments. I heard, Kenneth Pucker, you making the argument to stop, based largely around the fact that the fast fashion industry is a trend that is going in the wrong direction and accelerating, particularly just sheerly around the volume of the business, that volume itself is detrimental to the environment, that it's very, very negative for the carbon footprint, that 85% of this stuff ends up in landfills, which is implied is not good, that also these companies are involved in copyright infringement, that they are exploiting their workers, and that there are better ways to do this. And I'm hearing from you, Katherine Mangu-Ward, an argument that fast fashion, I think the thrust of your argument, the sort of unifying thing, is that fashion is good. Fashion satisfies the need for the consumers to express themselves, that there are lots of industries in the world that are involved in kinds of some of the practices that Kenneth is talking about. There's nothing special about fast fashion in this regard. You do acknowledge that slave labor is a problem that should be dealt with, but you also make the case that in the larger industry that there are people in the producing countries that are choosing to work in this field because they can make a better living doing that than they would doing a lot of other things that are available to them. So that's where I see kind of the fundamental divides between each of you. And Kenneth, what I would really like to go to you first to respond to the part of Katherine's argument that looks at this from the consumer's point of view, that having these choices is in itself a good thing, that it's, in a sense, a democratization of the fashion industry, that it's an act of self-expression, that it's great to be able to afford this stuff, that it satisfies some need in the consumer. It's almost a philosophical argument, but I'd like to just get your response to whether you find any of that persuasive.
So some of it is persuasive. I think that the idea that fashion is connected with art and creativity and expression is valid. I spent a good portion of my career in fashion. The company that I worked for actually had a lifetime guarantee on all of its products. And another company that I was an investor in, Timbuktu, also had a lifetime guarantee on all its products. So the intention was to sell something to someone that lasted a long time. When it comes to the question of price and democratization of fashion, I think we're well beyond that. In the United States, for example, the average consumer buys more than 50 items a year. Closet sizes have increased by more than 50% over the last 20 years. So if you look at and think about your own closet, my guess is that 80% of the stuff in there you never wear, right? So we're well beyond the need for more and more of something. If you're talking about democratization in terms of prices available to consumers in places far away from the US, in the developing South, there's already very low prices for fashion in most of those markets. And so I'm not convinced that we need more $8 halter tops or $9 jeans in order to feel better about ourselves.
So, Katherine, what I'm hearing there is the response to your argument. We already have enough stuff. Most of us already have enough stuff, indeed also to express our individuality through what we wear. And I'm not sure if you want to push back against the argument that most of us have clothes in our closet that we never wear. I know I do. But what do you think about Kenneth's point that, there's a point where it's just too much?
Yeah, I would be on very, very shaky ground if I was to claim that I have a perfectly curated capsule wardrobe waiting for me at home. So Ken is, of course, right about that. At the same time, I'm just always very wary of any argument that begins, I think we have enough. And I think that's because, for one thing, people's values differ. And I know that that's sort of obviously true on a very simple level, but so often I think the "don't you think we have enough" argument can be a tool of control, or a tool of censoriousness, or a tool of the powers that be. And we are, we're so lucky to live in the United States at a time when we are so wealthy and so prosperous. And yet we still saw the last presidential election, at least in part, hinge on the question of, hey, the ordinary stuff that I buy feels more expensive. And that is that's something that doesn't sit well with the public. So I think that the "don't you have enough clothes" question, yeah, I have enough clothes. Me personally, I have too many clothes. But I want to always be looking at the broader reasons, the larger dynamics of someone else deciding that I have enough. Because I think there are so many places in the world where, to say, oh, clothes are pretty cheap in the global South. Well, maybe, but, every dollar, is fungible. And if you can make it a little cheaper, in some places, that means more to eat. Here, maybe that's not always true, but it's just so important to keep that in sight.
Kenneth?
So with respect to the election, the current president-elect actually is recommending tariffs.
And it's going to be a disaster.
20 to 60% on imports from China, which will only make things far more expensive. When it comes to innovation in fashion, it's interesting. If one were to walk into a factory today in Southeast China, it wouldn't look very different from a factory from 100 years ago, literally, in terms of the machinery that's being used. The innovation has come from things like flying goods across the world, as opposed to putting them in a boat. And I'm not opposed to that. It's legal, but it has consequence. As I mentioned before, the emissions associated with flying goods are 40x what they are for shipping them by sea to get them here 9 days earlier. And no one's paying for those carbon emissions, meaning Shein and their private equity and venture and sovereign wealth fund owners who are benefiting from the excess consumption and the hauls that consumers are putting on social media, they're not paying for the effluent that's being leaked into waterways. They're not paying for the carbon emissions. They're not paying for the microplastics associated with polyester that gets washed in machines and ends up in waterways and back in the food system. So in addition, one more thing I will note is that there's a law in the US called the de minimis law, which allows packages to enter the United States of less than $800 to come in tax-free. And so what Shein did, which is clever, and it is legal, is they actually ship packages direct from China to consumers, less than $800, to avoid paying that tax. Gap, by contrast, who doesn't do that, ships to a distribution center and then to customers, paid $700 million in that tax in 2022. And so my concern is that there's not a lot of innovation in fashion. We don't need more stuff. And really all these externalities, all these side effects that society bears the costs of, the investors are the ones who are gaining from.
I'm just wondering, are we talking about two kinds of innovation here, where Katherine is talking about the innovation in what the fashion looks like and is made of, and what the artistic innovation, and Kenneth, you're talking about the innovation of production and delivery. I'll take that to you, Katherine, because there was a lot in what Kenneth had to say in terms of the industry not being particularly new in how it operates and makes clothes. that it's the system of delivery and shipping that is what's new and, in his view, detrimental.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would argue that there are positive innovations both on the kind of aesthetic and artistic side and on the kind of supply chain or commercial side. Unfortunately, I agree with Ken that there is this a lot of entities in this space are responding to poorly structured government incentives. So, as he notes, some of the debate around increased cost of consumer goods in this election centered around tariffs, which I think will create just massive deadweight loss and a lot of Sturm und Drang. And similarly, the description of how Sheehan's business model is basically a tax workaround. Yeah, let's reform that entire system. I agree with that. But I think if you take a slightly longer view, there really are all of these innovations that are that have kind of secondary effects in industry that come out of fashion. So, when we talk about textiles, as I would mention in the 15th century, kind of funding the Renaissance in a way, both, in terms of just sheer wealth, but also in terms of interaction between peoples. And I think that that's important to keep in mind. Similarly with department stores, right? Like the combination of rail and textile innovations and all kinds of things that brought together the possibility of a department store, which also had massive cultural impact. So I guess I want to say that maybe it is true that, factory floor making a T-shirt hasn't radically changed in recent years, but I think there's a lot more to it, and many of those innovations are positive.
Kenneth, do you want to respond?
Well, I think the biggest change that I've noted in fashion over the last really couple decades is the advent of fossil fuel. As I mentioned before, if you go back 30 or 40 years, most stuff was made from natural fibers, cotton, wool, leather, etc., that actually biodegrades over time. By contrast, when you buy a pair of Lululemon tights, for example, that are made from nylon, those tights will outlive your kids' in a landfill, okay? And they're contributing to both increased carbon emissions because they're made of oil, and also methane because they leak methane when they're in a landfill for all that period of time.
Kenneth, is that
so
just for me hearing that, is that literally true that the stuff won't biodegrade over 100, 150 years? Is that literally
Yes.
true, or is that a figure of speech that you're using?
No, I didn't make it up. You can look it up.
No, I'm not accusing you of that. I just want our audience to know.
Your Nike sneakers that are made of synthetics as well, your Lululemon tights, they will end up in a landfill, and unless they're incinerated, will last for generations.
I just want to take that fact back then to Katherine, because as I said in my opening, the part of the trend here is that people they're clearing their closets ultimately and throwing this stuff out. In preparing for this program, I saw a scene photographed from space from a satellite in Chile where there's a mountaintop covered with discarded clothing that covers acres and acres and acres. And it's if Kenneth is right, that's going to be there for a long, long time. So what about the disposable nature of this clothing having its impact on the environment? And that is new because this stuff wasn't being made in the volume 20 years ago that it is today.
As I was preparing for this debate, I had this kind of passing thought. So one issue, right, is not just that we use synthetics now, but that we use blends. And blends, as I understand it, are much harder to bring back into some kind of a circular reuse cycle, right? It's hard to separate fibers back out once they've been mixed together. What an Old Testament worry, right? Like this is one of the things that you find that you read in the Old Testament that's like, oh, we shouldn't mix our fibers in our garments. It'll make us unholy. So I think to me it just resonates always with like we have strong feelings about this, and we have a lot of worries about purity, and we have a lot of worries about impact on our world with what we do. The percentage of these landfills that are clothing is not disproportionate to its place in our economy. You might say, okay, well, we just want to reduce the size of this piece of our economy. But, I guess the desire to find better ways to dispose of these fabrics or garments or reuse them is very prevalent. And I know that Ken has written a lot about kind of the greenwashing and how it can be more of a marketing campaign than an effective strategy for resource use. But the fact is that there is a lot of demand for not just responsible consumer behavior, but responsible behavior on the part of the companies themselves. And while a lot of the technologies aren't there yet, we are working on it.
So fundamentally for you, this is it's not that big a deal. It's not an alarm for you. The alarm bells are not ringing on the environmental part of this for you. Just want to.
I mean, I think like alarm bells are ringing on the environment broadly. I think the sort of should I buy this shirt at H&M piece of the question is not the center, the sort of moral center of it.
Kenneth, I want to shift the topic a
John,
little bit.
Can I just
okay, no, go ahead, please.
Can I just respond to one thing, I'm sorry, that Katherine mentioned, which is apparel is, in fact, now a disproportionate share of landfills. I've been working with the state of New York because the fastest growing input to landfills in New York is, in fact, apparel. And that has changed in large part because of the advent of instant fashion and the increased consumption and the quicker half-life of fashion, at least in that city. I'll also say this notion of the textile blends that Katherine landed on, she's right. It is harder to actually recycle or upcycle a blend of fabric. So if you wear a pair of jeans now that has stretch in it, that's elastane. Elastane is made of fossil fuels. So you have cotton and elastane together, and there is not yet a technology that's able to separate those fibers in order to reuse them. But don't lose sight of the fact that the industry itself talks a lot about this notion of circularity or recycling. When you buy a garment that says it's made of recycled fibers, 99% of those garments come from plastic bottles. They come from old Coke or Sprite or Mountain Dew bottles that are reground up and then woven into polyester and then made into garments again. Less than 1% of all fashion that's made today is made from old fashion, which is, upcycling in a circular fashion. And we're approaching now 100 million tons of textile waste each year that's being disposed of. These numbers are all accelerating faster than the rate of growth of GDP, in large part because the prices of the stuff continues to decline.
Katherine, can you take on also Kenneth's argument about the exploitation of workers? Now, you kind of bounced off, slave labor is a bad thing, which is not a very controversial position to be taken. But can you take it on with a little bit more depth and breadth than you did in your opening?
Absolutely. Since I've already dated myself, I will say, when I was in college in the late 90s, it was the end of history, right? And so there was not a lot of controversy for college students to get mad about. But one topic that did come up, the kind of last thing that people were protesting in that period, was sweatshops. And so this conversation has been going on for a really long time. And, I think that it's really, for me, a question of perspective taking. So I would not enjoy being a textile worker in Bangladesh, I'm sure. I like the job that I have a lot more. But for the people who do those jobs, the options that they have otherwise are just substantially worse in so many cases. And I think that there is this tendency to say those jobs shouldn't exist. It's just so important to ask, well, what's the alternative? If the alternative is subsistence farming, if the alternative is no employment for women, because those jobs are disproportionately held by women, this can really take us to a place, again, of kind of paternalism. And, conditions in these factories vary hugely. And I think that it's completely reasonable for a brand to pursue, working with partners who treat their workers ethically. But I think that the kind of broad-based, we shouldn't as a nation or as individuals do business with people whose lives are so radically different from our own. It takes us to a place of isolationism. It takes us to a place where the people who are the least well off in this equation become worse off.
So, Kenneth, what is your call to action then to the consumer in your taking the side stop? Is your argument that you would appeal to the listener to not patronize these these companies, not to buy their wares. And in that context, I want you to also to address the fact that, again, this is a chance for these people to participate in fashion in a way that they couldn't otherwise. And incidentally, a lot of these companies offer things in sizes extra small, extra large, that the traditional fashion world is not making available in your basic old-fashioned department store. So what is your appeal to the consumer in arguing stop?
So before I answer that, I just want to address what Katherine mentioned about workers and values. I agree with her. I think that we shouldn't decide what jobs make sense for people in places far away. I'm arguing instead that those jobs and those factories be regulated in a way that creates safety and a living wage. So we talked about Bangladesh, for example. 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago now, there was a building collapse in Bangladesh that killed 1,100 people, almost all women, making clothes for Western brands. That's, to me, not a standard that we should think is healthy. The vast majority of workers in Bangladesh were on strike. Many of them were killed over the last couple of weeks, protesting wages, which are mostly below living wages. So I'm not arguing people shouldn't work in shoe factories or apparel factories. Ancestors of ours did that in the Northeast for many years. I'm just arguing about conditions. Now, to respond to your question, John, about what should consumers do, I don't think consumers are going to solve this problem, okay, any more than I think investors or companies themselves are going to solve these problems. The system incentives make it really complicated for any of those parties to solve the problem on their own. Consumers, for example, if I were to ask you what's better for your health and what's better for the planet, organic strawberries or conventional, I think it's pretty binary and you can make your own judgment with which you think is healthier for you or the planet. If I ask you what's better for the planet, an organic cotton t-shirt, a cotton t-shirt, or a nylon t-shirt, the answer is it depends. And it depends on a life cycle analysis, which can run 200 pages. And it depends if you care about water or if you care about emissions. It depends on the gauge of the thread. It depends on the country of origin, the source of primary energy, a whole bunch of things. So consumers can't figure this out. And they've been lied to by brands for many years about what's green and sustainable and circular, et cetera. So I don't think consumers should be the ones who are responsible for solving this problem. I don't think that's going to work.
And the point that I made, that the kinds of selection and choice that is presented to them, does that make these products irresistible in a sense to the consumer?
Well, you 2 points. One, the affordability of them sort of does make them irresistible. Mm-hmm. $9 jeans instead of $90 jeans means you can buy a lot more and dispose of them more quickly. The part about extended sizes, small sizes, large sizes, that to me is not that compelling. These brands don't exist principally to sell extended size ranges.
Katherine, what do you think about that last point? Because I think it's something that people listening to this program might focus in on. That's the reason they like to shop in these places.
I mean, I think that there's, that's sort of obviously true on a very simple level, that, we had this debate about a lot of other topics as well. We had this debate about food. Is there some point where food becomes too cheap or hyper palatable or, in many cases subsidized? Certain elements of our food system are subsidized, others are taxed, maybe in a way that doesn't make sense if you're thinking from a perspective of human health. I'm an editor of a libertarian magazine, so you will absolutely find agreement from me if the conversation we're having is, hey, are there a bunch of weird distortions in this system that are creating suboptimal behavior on the part of consumers? Yes, but where I have a harder time meeting you is, and so the role of the state here is to reshape those preferences, even from some very kind of common, longstanding preferences that people have. I also, because we just started talking about Bangladesh the entire time, do want to throw one last number in, which is that from 1990 to the kind of early 2010s, the poverty rate in Bangladesh dropped from 43% to 18.5%. And the International Labor Organization says that's because of the garment industry.
I've got to break
again,
in, so thanks, Katherine, for letting me interrupt you there. And now we're going to bring in some other voices, people who write or think about and study this issue, and they're all going to come in and ask what we hope will be a provocative and conversation inspiring question. And first, I'd like to welcome Vanessa Friedman. Vanessa is fashion director and chief fashion critic for the New York Times. Vanessa, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us on the program.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
And you've been listening to the conversation, and what's the thought or question that you'd like to introduce?
I actually want to follow up on your point about consumers. I think the place that we all that both arguments meet is this agreement that everyone has the right to self-expression through fashion. And that was the beginning premise of fast fashion. But somewhere along the way, that became everyone has the right to more stuff. And that has shaped our behavior and trickled up to all different levels of the fashion chain, from the lowest, cheapest clothing to the highest, most expensive clothing. And we're now stuck in this sort of spiral of more and more stuff and thinking of items as increasingly disposable. And that I don't think is good for anyone. So my question to both Katherine and Kenneth is, how do we get people to start to value their clothing again at whatever price they can afford? Right? How do we start to understand the human work that goes in, the materials that go in, and the idea that, in fact, once you buy something, you can keep it for a while?
Vanessa, who would you like to take that question on first? Always an important choice.
I'd actually like to start with Kenneth.
All right.
And then go to Katherine.
Thanks, Vanessa. Kenneth, you're up.
So I think it's a great question. I think it's going to be really hard. And I think it's because the interests of the companies aren't aligned with the behavior you're seeking to achieve. Advertising campaigns, marketing campaigns, insistence that one season straight leg jeans are in and next season wide leg jeans are in. It's an attempt by companies to get you to buy yet another item. And the conditioning and priming that goes on, which is consistent, by the way, with the goals of the company. It makes sense for the companies to do this, are inconsistent with the behavior that you seek to achieve. So I think it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think, hopefully without appearing to curry favor with the questioner, that probably the answer is what you do, right? That part of this world that we live in that has this hyper speed, very hyper connected fashion industry is also a world with communications that exist at that same speed. And so one answer here is, well, we have to figure out how to tell compelling stories. And, if the compelling stories are about, showing the shot of the pile of clothes from space, great. If the compelling stories are about worker conditions, great. If the compelling stories are about, the geopolitics of Uyghur, slave camps, got to talk about that too. And I think also it's, hey, sometimes you just buy an orange dress at H&M in 2010 and you wear it until it falls to pieces because you loved it and it was perfect. And it doesn't matter that it only cost $30. I was the person who bought that orange dress. I miss it still to this very day. So I think it's probably compelling storytelling.
Vanessa, when we have time, I like to allow for a follow-up, and we do have a little bit of time. Do you have a response to what you heard?
Yeah, I think, Kenneth, in particular, you can't let consumers off the hook with this. And in some ways, companies are, respond to consumer behavior. So I do think consumers have some responsibility in this situation. And, in a way, companies can tell stories, to Katherine's point, that also show the value of their clothing. Why shouldn't they?
So I would tell you that, as I mentioned before, I worked at a company and was an investor in another for more than 20 years that did what you're suggesting, meaning offering, Patagonia is another one that offers a lifetime warranty. If someone bought a boat shoe from Timberland and 15 years later the sole was falling off, we would replace it without question for free, okay? Because we were trying to sell this notion of, actually a tagline of ours was more quality than you may ever need. Okay, so there is a place, and there are a number of companies that have succeeded with that model. Unfortunately, they are subsumed in terms of volume by companies that succeed with a different model, that is one that sells hyperconsumption.
Okay, I've got to move on to the next. Vanessa, I'm sorry, I have to move on to the next question. But thank you so much for joining us. And I've just had a recollection come back that recently, in a box of stuff from the attic of our old home, I found some shirts that my dad wore in the 1940s in the Navy, and they are solid, still holding together amazingly well. And I gave them to my two kids in their 20s who are now enjoying wearing around these 60, 70-year-old shirts. Just amazing, as we're talking about not throwing stuff out. I want to now bring in James Woodhousen, who is a visiting professor at London South Bank University, also a broadcaster at BBC Radio 4. James, thanks so much for joining us on the program. And please come in with your question.
Well, it's a very enjoyable show. Mr. Pucker, I've put you in my book on design in the 2030s, and I think it was in the Harvard Business Review in 2022 that you wrote, very perceptively, I thought, few industries tout their sustainability credentials more forcefully than fashion. Products ranging from swimsuits to wedding dresses are marketed as carbon positive, organic, or vegan. Recycling, resale, rental, reuse, and repair are sold as environmental lifesavers. And then you continued in a new paragraph. The sad truth, however, is that all this experimentation and supposed innovation in the fashion industry over the past 25 years have failed to lessen its planetary impact. So what I want to know is, while you're telling people in the East and the South that they've already got lots of cheap clothes and the clothes are cheap there and they've got their wardrobes full and so on, I want to know from you what your practical solution is to the fact, for example, that China, in the past 5 years, according to the International Energy Agency, has built more production capacity for ethylene and propylene, the two key building blocks in petrochemicals, than more capacity in 5 years than Europe, Japan, and Korea have.
James, I've kind of lost track of where you're going. So how would you nail this with your question?
Well, the point is that, the synthetics, which you point to, Kenneth, have made a very big difference and will continue to make a very big difference as China builds more capacity, as it has done, to make synthetic fibers. And low prices for the global East and the global South are going to trump your argument for doing what exactly? To ensure real circularity, to make the lowering of the emissions that you want. It's not going to happen. There are lots and lots of clothes.
So is your question to Kenneth, is your battle futile?
Well, I want to know his practical program.
Okay,
getting the masses in the East and the South.
Okay, I got to jump in just because in the interest of time, I have to jump in. Kenneth, if you can take that question, thanks, James.
Okay,
it's sort of like, what do we do about it?
Okay, my proposal would be maybe some of which Katherine will agree with, some won't. I do think that we need different rules. If you want different behavior, you need different rules. And so, for example, I looked this up prior to the debate. The year I was born, a pack of cigarettes cost 25 cents. In New York City today, I think a pack of cigarettes costs $20. The difference isn't it costs more to make tobacco. The difference is that we taxed a sin good in order to deal with the externalities associated with smoking, health, and secondhand smoke. I believe that what we should do is tax virgin synthetics in order to compensate for the negative externalities associated with. I also think we should I've been sponsoring an act in New York City called the New York Fashion Act. Actually, it's in New York State, that requires that companies that are north of $100 million in revenue commit to deliver on their science-based targets, which means absolute carbon emissions reductions of 5% a year, which they've signed up for, been approved for, but they must do it. Otherwise, there could be consequences, including a 2% fine on global revenue by the New York State Attorney General. So I think we need different rules. We can argue about which rules.
Your rules are for your rules.
Well, James, just again, in the interest of time, I want to let Katherine respond to what Kenneth had to say, and I thank you for taking part in the program. Katherine, I know you're not big on rules, so I'm waiting to see what you're going to say about this.
I like rules when they are voluntarily agreed to by the parties, and I like I like rational regulation. And I think that it's absolutely true that right now the incentives on this industry are bonkers and getting weirder. So, from that perspective, a reevaluation makes sense. But I think when we craft these rules and regulations with the idea that, you introduced the word sin, right? Like the idea that just wanting to buy a cheap tank top is a sin. That is, to me, that brings in so many other questions about who does get to decide on those points. And I think that the odds that a group of smarty smart pants who also have government power are going to get this right are pretty low.
Thanks, James, for joining us. And now I want to bring in Dana Thomas, who is author of Fashionopolis, Why What We Wear Matters. She also writes the weekly Substack newsletter, The Style Files, on fashion and culture. Dana, thanks so much for joining us on the program.
Thanks for having me. It's a joy to be here.
And what do you have to bring into the conversation in terms of a question or a thought?
Basically, we haven't been talking about the brands and the companies. And while we have been talking about the labor, which is among the lowest paid in the world, and people are impoverished, the owners of these companies are among the 50 richest people in the world. And they're making all their money from not paying people along the supply chain and not being responsible for what they make. So you mentioned a little bit about legislation, but this is one of the least regulated industries out there, and they're not responsible for the waste. 20% of what they produce never even hits the retail floor. It goes straight into landfill or gets destroyed. Do we need to hold the brands more responsible for the mess that they're making around the world? Clothes washing up on the beaches in Africa and moldering in our landfills for eternity and filling deserts in Chile. Should we have some legislation that really holds their feet to the fire?
So I'm sensing, Dana, your question is more of a challenge to Katherine at this point. Am I right
it's
about
that? It's for
that?
both. I would like to hear, I know about the New York Fashion Act, but does it really hold brands accountable, or is it still about consumers? What about the brands?
Okay. I'm going to go first to Kenneth with that one. Kenneth, if you can take that on, please.
Sure. The New York Fashion Act is aimed at brands, not at consumers. It is aimed at brands that have revenues in excess of $100 million that choose to sell in the state of New York, and they're the ones who are subject to the provisions of the bill.
Now, but with that in mind, state of New York is one of 50 states in America. How do we get this to be national or even international?
So the reason it's being introduced in New York and now actually in Washington State and also in Massachusetts is because brands won't set up separate supply chains for different states. And brands above $100 million can't afford not to sell in New York or California. And so it will become de facto federal in terms of behavior if it is passed in those states.
Katherine, I'd like to hear your response to the question as well.
Sure. I'll just say very briefly, it's true that fashion is one of the least regulated industries. And I think it's not a coincidence that it's also one of the most dynamic, interesting, and, an industry that is producing falling costs in a time when more regulated industries typically have rising costs.
So you're saying those are good things, and those are good things in and of themselves, and that those are a result of the relative lack of regulation.
That said, of course, we do have a problem with open access commons, right? When we talk about these type of issues where the costs have been socialized, it's almost always because we haven't found a good way of building structures to privatize those costs, to bring them back within the companies. And I think being thoughtful about that, whether it's carbon pricing or something else, is something that I'm open to in a way that let's put a tax on subcategory of garment X or corporate behavior X strikes me as too specific and too likely to end up just creating bad incentives of its own.
Dana, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, in France, for example, brands are not allowed to sell more or produce more than they can sell. You cannot destroy unsold goods anymore like you used to be able to, that you could just like shred them or burn them or throw water on them in the dumpster and say, oh, they've been destroyed. In France now, you're not allowed to do that. And they're looking at doing that across the EU, where basically trying to reduce overconsumption. Is there a way we can do that in the United States? And can we do that globally?
Let's again go to each of you on that, Kenneth.
I don't know if we can do that. I mean, it would require legislation. I don't think, as Katherine said, legislation would be well advised if it were introduced by smarty pants. Nor do I think it would be possible were you to hew to the standard that all impacted parties agreed to the legislation. I doubt that the cigarette industry agreed to be legislated, but I do think we need legislation to make sure the commons that you're talking about are protected. And this industry, in large part because it is not regulated, is now one of the worst offenders in terms of socializing the costs.
Katherine, your turn.
Yeah, again, when I say I think people should be allowed to do things where all parties agree, I'm talking about consensual commercial transactions. There is no such thing as legislation where all parties agree. And I think that there are still so many opportunities. There's still so much demand to find better ways to do this voluntarily. And I think it's important to lean into those.
Dana, thank you so much for your question and for bringing that topic into the conversation. We had not really gone there, and I really appreciate your bringing us in that move into that direction. So that's a wrap on this portion of the program, which means we're going to our closing statements. And in our closing statements, each side once again gets to make their case, but in briefer form, 2 minutes or less. Once again, our question is fast fashion, shop or stop. Kenneth, you are arguing stop. This is your final chance to tell us why you are arguing stop on fast fashion. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks, John. I can say that I tried. I served for 15 years at outdoor clothing and footwear brand Timberland. And for those who don't know, the company was publicly traded but family controlled. I worked for the third generation to lead the company, who changed the mission of the company in the year 2000 to be one of equal parts commerce and justice, a word you don't often hear in business today. Justice was comprised of 3 elements: global human rights, citizen service, and environmental stewardship. And the company was often awarded for its sustainability accomplishments, including a presidential award we received from the Bush administration. During my tenure as Chief Operating Officer, we proudly reported that our carbon emissions dropped by double digits for 7 consecutive years as our revenues grew by more than 10%. And it was true, it was only part of the story. Our reported emissions covered our headquarters and our purchased electricity, and those did decline. However, our supply chain emissions associated with making the products increased. If you ask me how much they increased, I'm not sure, as we weren't able to report on our Scope 3 emissions, our value chain emissions. But even today, 15 years later, less than half of public companies even report on their value chain emissions, let alone set targets for reduction. This, while the atmosphere is warming faster than at any time recorded in human history, and temperatures are now up over 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Recall that I worked for a company that was privately held and led by a sustainability zealot. If Timberland couldn't deliver authentic sustainability improvements, imagine what it means for most companies who don't even try. My sense is that neoliberal, unregulated, voluntary sustainability doesn't work. And I think it's time for a different model of capitalism.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. And Katherine, you get the last word with your closing statement.
First of all, I've just really, really enjoyed this debate. I think in part because, like everything that y'all do at Open for Debate, it's so calm. Everyone's just doing their best to make good arguments, including the wonderful questioners. So thank you for that. I'm just going to make my final defense of fast fashion, which is that we need to recognize that it is in many, many ways a force for good, even as we are serious about the challenges. So fast fashion makes trends accessible to people of all income levels. It lets people experiment with style and self-expression. It's an economic engine for developing countries and has been for decades. It has a proven record of that. It offers jobs and livelihoods to people who have fewer opportunities than we do, especially women. And I think that there are still reasons to be optimistic about technology paving the way for meaningful improvements. I understand that Kenneth has been through the wars and has done his best, but the world remains in constant technological upheaval. And I think that we didn't even get a chance to talk about AI optimized supply chain, blockchain for transparency, textile recycling that works differently than what we have today. I don't know which of those things it's going to be. Neither do the governments of the world. And I think that the brands are in the position to see those opportunities and to figure out how to sell them to customers. Over-regulating the sector, I think, is far more likely to harm workers and consumers by driving up costs and reducing employment opportunities. So instead of looking for ways to do less, have less, be less, I think we should be leaning into what's worked before and which will continue to work in other industries, which is to promote innovation and to sort of cherish the thing that is special in fashion, which is that the intellectual property conditions and the economic conditions, the fact that we do live in a globalized world, mean that everyone all around the world is trying really hard to figure out the best way forward on this.
Thank you very much, Katherine. And that is a wrap on this debate. And Katherine, I want to thank you for the plug for what we're doing, because to both you, Katherine Mangu-Ward, and you, Kenneth Pucker, really, really embraced and embodied the thing that we try to do here, which is to show that we can disagree with one another, but we can do so in a way that is civil and respectful. And both of you brought exactly that approach to this debate. So I really want to thank you both for taking part in it, also for taking part in the way that you did. Thanks for joining us.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
And I also want to thank our fellow, my fellow questioners who came into the conversation, Vanessa, James, and Dana. Thank you for your questions and your observations, which also, as I said before, moved us in an interesting direction. And a big thank you to you, our audience, for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate. I want to thank you very much for listening. You know, as a nonprofit working to combat extreme polarization through what you just saw, civil debate, our work is made possible by listeners like you and by the Rosencrantz Foundation and by supporters of Open to Debate. Our chairman is Robert Rosencrantz, our CEO is Clay O'Connor, Leah Matthau is our Chief Content Officer, Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our Chief Advancement Officer. This episode was produced by Alexis Pengrazi, Jessica Glazer, and Marlette Sandoval. Editorial and research by Gabriella Mayer and Andrew Foote. Andrew Lipson and Max Fulton provided production support. The Open to Debate team also includes Gabrielle Iannicelli, Rachel Kemp, Eric Gross, Linda Lee, Savion Jackson, and Mary Regas. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement, and I'm John Donvan, your host. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.